Breaking Point, the 7th episode of Band of Brothers, is one of those episodes that stays with you and is the first one that comes to mind whenever you mention the program. This episode continued the story of Sergeant Lipton from episode 6 titled Bastogne, but used a different style while remaining set in the Ardennes forest. It was as if this episode were a series of diary entries, giving us a glimpse inside Lip's thoughts and feelings as he described what happened and how many of the men were at the end of their rope. The men were literally pushed to their limits in this episode, which was named Breaking Point. Death, bad leadership, difficult conditions, and the loss of fellow workers were all adding insult to injury. From Buck, Compton, and Hoobler to Lipton and Guarnere, Toye and Winters, and everywhere in between. We won't waste any more time. Instead, we'll go into the episode and analyze it thoroughly. Part 7 of this Band of Brothers series is detailed here. You should be aware that this video contains spoilers. 4 long-time employees of Easy Company were interviewed to begin off the show, as is customary with each episode. Richard Winters, Daryl Shifty Powers, Joe Lesnilski, and Donald Malaki were all part of our group. Despite the length of the broadcast, this round of interviews felt much shorter than the others. It was fitting that the subject matter they were discussing belonged to the episode's titular Breaking Point. The guys being interrogated recounted their experiences in the Ardennes forest, describing their mindset and how they were on the verge of losing it. Everything revolved around the dead and the situation. Many of the attendees had their perspectives modified by the passing of friends and acquaintances. You can't even begin to fathom the extent to which hearing that the men were encircled by bodies their own, civilians, enemy, and even animal can hit a person. Being in the presence of your worst nightmares, while also knowing that you could be one of them, the person who died in an instant, must be incredibly terrifying. The segment with Malaki in particular made these interviews among the most emotionally taxing to see. Almost in tears, he was explaining how he couldn't care for his friends the way one would normally during that time. He went on to say that even now, years later, he can't shake the memories of what happened and the people he lost, and that it always finds a way to haunt him. He went to black as he stated this, visibly distraught. This was a pivotal moment because it set the stage for Malaki to lose 3 close friends at work in a span of hours later in the show. After watching the show and getting a better grasp of the real-life Donald Malaki's emotions, this line and its impact hit home much more. The first part of the interviews did a great job of setting the scene and focusing on the brutal, unforgiving circumstances and the mindset that many of the men were experiencing at the time. The mental and physical toll was too much, and by January 1945 they had reached their breaking point inside Bastogne. Being able to hear the true hero stories, even in brief excerpts, is a powerful aspect of the presentation, and the interviews are a great way to supplement what we witness later on. Plus, it helps us relate what they've said to the plot we're following. From a creative standpoint, I'm really happy that the showrunners went with that direction. It works well. It was January 2, 1945, when the episode subsequently began. This episode took place just days after General Patton's Third Army freed the 101st Airborne Division from German lines. The events shown in episode 6 in Bastogne occurred around Christmas time, something that the 101st State didn't think was required and didn't need anymore. Now Easy were ordered to drive the Germans out of the Bulge and clear the woods around Foy in preparation for the 13th of January attack on Foy. As we delve into this opening segment, one of the initial things we witness sets the tone and setting for the rest of the episode. Hoobler passed away at this moment. There was this unfinished business of Hoobler's getting his hands on a Luger. Plus, he beheaded a mounted German soldier in this initial portion. Plus, while he was searching the man, he found a Luger that he had wanted since before D-Day. The fact that Hoobler's death was not the result of an enemy strike made it all the more tragic. It was completely unintentional. Donald Hoobler's death was directly related to his desire to acquire the Luger. He stashed it in his pocket once he had it, but the heavy outerwear he was donning in response to the frigid weather set off the gun, and a bullet pierced his leg, severing his femoral artery. Although the events depicted in the show were consistent with Hoobler's desire for a Luger, the actual Donald Hoobler met a similar but not identical demise. Reportedly, the German soldier on horseback was captured as a prisoner after Hoobler shot at him, although he did not actually kill him. There are rumors that the Luger didn't originate from him, and some even wonder if he ever had one. While it is true that Hoobler did die on January 3 from a gunshot wound, the question of whether or not he really obtained a Luger raises doubts about whether or not the gun was his own. On the other hand, there's talk that it might have been a Luger. He was supposedly too pleased to be playing about with it when it went off in his pocket, but that's just speculation. Unlike in the show, Hoobler actually passed away not long after reaching an aid station. He did not die on the pitch. This aspect of the event may not have been entirely factual, but it certainly added to the ambiguity surrounding his death and shifted the focus to the Luger, which was his desired outcome. One important part of this episode was also revealed by Hoobler's demise. Even though SGT, Carl Lipton, was there, ready to step up and be the leader the company needed and wanted when they were being led astray by LT, Dike, who was deemed incompetent. Compared to the real-life Norman Dike, the portrayal of Dike in this film is wildly inaccurate. Throughout this period, Dike remained gone for the majority of the preparatory work leading up to the 13th of January assault on Toye. He showed a complete lack of concern for the situation, the soldiers fighting by his side, the significance of their lives, and the details of the plan's execution. The situation became so dire that numerous guys from Easy Company lost their lives as a result. The real-life Norman Dike, on the other hand, was far from inept. Many great deeds were really performed by him. For his bravery in Holland, he received a Bronze Star. For his exploits in Bastogne, where he rescued 3 wounded men from an exposed position when his company was under heavy fire, he received a second Bronze Star. The decision to do it is particularly bizarre because it doesn't match how Dike was introduced in the episode. I'm going to assume they did this because, according to Carl Lipton, Dike appeared to have nearly collapsed during the attack on Toye on January 13th. Dike appeared to have sustained a wound, which is likely what prompted him to halt. He wasn't as terrified as he appeared on the show, but he came dangerously close to being paralyzed by his injuries. The assault on Toye in the show and Dike's behavior likely fell apart because to that. Like many of the other males in the organization, Winters wasn't very complimentary of Dike. It seems he was uninterested as shown. He frequently vanished and hid in a foxhole instead of engaging in combat. As a result of this, he became known as Foxhole Norman. Therefore, the show did use some artistic license with this character, but there were also certain realities embedded in it. The encounter also revealed something about the other men that stood in stark contrast to Dike, their dedication and loyalty. Toye, for instance, couldn't bear the thought of leaving the men he was fighting with at the aid station, so he returned from his shift immediately. This demonstrated how willing they were to sacrifice everything for each other on the pitch, to the point that Toye was hit and lost a leg upon his eventual return. He could have skipped out on being present at that exact moment, but he opted to stay. Plus, it was completely backwards, with Dike taking the attitude of fleeing and leaving for help, and Guarnere also getting attacked and losing a leg while he sought to save his friend. Their level of attachment to each other was clearly evident. True devotion and togetherness shone through, demonstrating that they could persevere in the face of an inept and emotionally distraught leader. Everything that has happened at Easy Company is a direct result of the team's unique bond, shared experiences, and fundamental knowledge of how to persevere in the face of adversity. In the beginning of the show, there was a scene that hinted at something later on. Since his injury in Operation Market Garden, Buck has been a shadow of his former self throughout the previous several episodes. In this episode, the man's broken nature was at its worst. After witnessing what happened to Hoobler, he was determined to save the other guys the pain of death, so we watched as he warned them not to do anything foolish. As a result, Heffron compared him to a mad person. After Buck saw his 2 best friends, Guarnere and Toye, laying there, each missing a leg, he got to his feet, removed his helmet, and stared at them in silence. At that moment, Buck Compton appeared to have hit rock bottom, and there seemed to be no turning back, to the point that we witnessed his removal from the queue and subsequent evacuation to Trenchford. But in all honesty, it was due to his mental state and the impact of witnessing his 2 closest companions lying there injured. Although the atrocities of Bastogne struck me, I do not believe I was clinically shelf-horrified as the series betrays me, Buck stated in his memoirs. On the contrary, he felt as though the Germans were about to crush them at that moment. His expression betrayed his sense of helplessness at the situation. We observed that no respect was lost for Compton, despite his evacuation owing to his mindset not being in the correct place, thanks to Lipton's narration over the top. Because before that, he sacrificed everything for the sake of the guys he served with, prioritizing their safety and security. Once again, it is very different from Dike's. An analogy was made in this episode between dread and a disease or poison at one point. It had the potential to spread and infect others. Therefore, they would frequently remove guys from the queue when they were afraid. In no way to advance their own interest, but rather to the benefit of the business and its division. For the simple reason that the men's mindset would crumble if panic broke out. Malachi primarily demonstrated this by losing 3 of his close friends in the span of a day, demonstrating that a mere distance of a few hundred meters from the queue might have a profound effect on someone's state of mind, allowing them to feel more at ease. My favorite part of this episode had to be the scene where Toye was dragging himself across the floor while yelling, "I gotta get up." It was so tragic to see. The screen did a great job of conveying the fear and passion in his voice, and you could almost sense his anguish, isolation, and vulnerability as he spoke. In this episode, Spears was also one of the main characters. Regarding the shooting down of the German POWs, rumors regarding his actions on D-Day persisted. Spears plays the role of an icy character on the show. He's as icy and unforgiving as the snow that fell in Bastogne. I appreciated that he saw the benefit of keeping that image ingrained in everyone's memory, which is why this rumor has persisted. The uncertainty and terror it instilled in their minds about him. Because the men were confused about how to respond, he gained their respect as a result of their perceived lack of control over him. During the attack on Foy, Spears became involved as well since Dike had been unprepared and had panicked to the point that he had stopped obeying Winter's instructions. We saw Spears as a machine, and he was dedicated and smart enough to walk into oncoming fire. His comments to Blythe in the third episode of the show, in which he said that one must have accepted their death as a fact of life in order to operate there, were relevant here. What transpired next depends on Winters sending him in to relieve Dike of leadership. If he hadn't, the assault on Foy would have been quite different. This is something that you can observe him thinking about on the broadcast. Some have speculated that Spears' decision to go in and relieve Dike was only coincidental, given that she was the first person present when Winters turned. What we witnessed Spears accomplish on the program was based on real events. He wished he could change Dike's orders for the guys, but he couldn't connect with Item Company by radio. Instead, he broke through the German line to let the corporation know about the change in plans. He then led the company to victory by jogging back through the town. It was because of this that he became the show's Easy Company co., and he stayed in that role until the war's end, making him Easy's longest-serving commander. Now, we came to this episode because of the main character we followed, Carl Lipton, and his role is a big part of why it's so fantastic. The ability to hear his thoughts and have him narrate and write down every detail allowed us to see into his mind and understand what he was going through, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. This included his dislike of Dike and his fears, which he had voiced, as well as his genuine belief that Foy would fail and that Dike would cause men to die. The absurdity of comparing a shellacking to fireworks on July 4th, along with the seriousness of his obligations and concern for soldiers who weren't even his duty. Dike was the ideal leader for the organization during its worst hour, and Lipton exemplified that ideal. The men looked up to him because he was respectful, caring, and reassuring. He also carried himself with confidence. We saw this most clearly as he dashed through the foyer, just as the sniper was about to kill the man who had thought they had succeeded. He put himself in danger so that the sniper may be hit. At the conclusion, Spears addresses Lipton directly, telling him that the guys trusted him more than anybody else, and that he had served as the unofficial chief executive officer of Easy Company. He was informed of his promotion to lieutenant at the end of it. There are 1,000 words conveyed by this single image of Lipton's expressionless shock. There was a lot of power despite the terror, relief, destruction, and loss of life. The resilience that emerged from the depths of Bastogne, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. He persevered until he reached his breaking point, and then he became the leader they needed. Despite his relief at having survived, he was devastated by the number of casualties. He was perfectly correct in stating that the company suffered serious losses. Out of 145 soldiers who went there, only 63 were returning. I thought it was the perfect way to have a lighthearted sequence as the episode's last one. Despite the episode's heaviness, it was one of the series' darkest. We caught a glimpse of Luz's lighthearted thanks to the guys for dropping feces in their foxholes as it ended. In addition, Lipton was seen lighting up, a clear sign of his transformation. Prior to the events in Bastogne, Lipton did not smoke. This demonstrated the difficulty of his situation and served as a metaphor for how different men were upon their departure from Bastogne compared to their arrival. In my review, I gushed about how outstanding this Band of Brothers episode was. Without a doubt, it is among the top ones. 2 episodes that work wonderfully together and separately are Bastogne and Breaking Point. This episode stood apart from the rest of the series in terms of its stylistic approach. As we listened to Lipton's thoughts and feelings, it was as if we were reading his diary entries, which gave us a unique insight into the character's thoughts and feelings. The episode's depiction of Dike as a completely unique character from the rest of Airs gave characters like Lipton and Spears a chance to shine and reveal their heroic qualities by contrasting him with the bravery, loyalty, and friendliness of guys much lower in rank. A lot of the events between Buck, Toye, and Guarnere, as well as Hoobler at the beginning, made for some extremely moving moments in this episode. It painted a different picture of battle casualties, demonstrating that accidents happen and that carelessness can be lethal. It was shocking and unexpected. Despite being the longest episode together with the pilot, this one felt incredibly short. It was so engrossing that the time passed quickly. If you ask me, Band of Brothers is most engrossing during Bastogny. Everything from the heat to the shortage of supplies to the loss of life to morale is palpable. The fact that it seems so realistic makes it one of my favorite portions of the whole series. The title of the episode, Cracking Point, gave the impression that the men were finally cracking under the weight of all they had been through. I thought the episode's emotional investment in the interviews was particularly high because of the weight of the topic death and the intensity with which they were delivered. One can easily comprehend the mental toll that working in what was effectively a cemetery would take on a man. Without a doubt, this is a top-tier episode. Every single one of them is fantastic, but this one really stands out to me. Without a doubt, it has been and likely always will be. The Last Patrol, the 8th episode, is both intense and has a very stressful atmosphere. Next week, I can't wait to dive into that one. This concludes our analysis of the 7th episode of Band of Brothers. It pains me to admit that this video was late. There have been so many new shows that it has been difficult for me to focus on this video, even though I was incredibly excited to cover this particular episode. However, I will promptly begin working on my analysis of episode 8. Just click the card up there if you're interested in seeing more Band of Brothers videos. Another option is to visit my channel, where I review each episode of the show. Stay tuned for my coverage of Band of Brothers. After that, I'll be heading on to the Pacific. In your opinion, how was episode 7? Post your opinions in the space provided. Please stay tuned for the next video, and I appreciate you watching this one.